London, 1850. The heart of an empire. A city teeming with power, wealth, and progress. But beneath the grandeur, beneath the flickering gas lamps, beneath the clatter of carriages and the rustle of silk, something stirs in the shadows. Thousands of them. Crawling through sewers, hiding in tenement walls, scuttling across floorboards in the dead of night. Rats. Millions of rats. And where there are rats, there are rat catchers. Armed with little more than a stick, a sack, and, if they were lucky, a ferret, these unsung warriors of the underworld waged a filthy, desperate war against one of the deadliest forces of the Victorian age. Not kings. Not soldiers. But vermin. They were scavengers. Showmen. Sometimes heroes. Often frauds. And always, on the edge of ruin or fame. In this episode of Historap, we dive deep into the disease-ridden alleys and sewer-choked shadows of 19th century London. We'll uncover how rats became a symbol of the city's darkest anxieties, poverty, pestilence, and the fragility of empire. And we'll follow the twisted, true stories of the men who hunted them, not out of civic duty, but for survival, spectacle, and sometimes, salvation. This is not just a story about vermin. This is a story about the people who stood toe-to-toe with an empire's filth, armed with nothing but a stick, a dog, and an iron will. This is the world of the rat catchers. London's rat crisis. To understand the rise of the rat catcher, we must first understand the battlefield. Victorian London was a marvel of its time, epic in scale, teeming with life, ambition, and noise. But beneath its splendor, the city was collapsing under the weight of its own success. By the mid-19th century, London was the largest city in the world, boasting over 2.5 million souls. But rapid industrialization had brought more than just jobs and innovation. It had brought overcrowding, chaos, and rot. Families were packed like sardines into one-room tenements. Sewage flowed freely in the streets. The Thames, once a source of life, became an open sore. In the poorest areas, such as Whitechapel, Shoreditch, and Southwark, waste piled up in alleyways, human, animal, and industrial. Wherever waste accumulated, the rats followed. They were everywhere. In the cellars of butchers, in the backrooms of bakeries, nesting behind loose bricks in chimney flues, scurrying beneath pub floorboards, and burrowing into the haylofts of stables. London's rats were not shy. They were streetwise, adaptable, and terrifyingly prolific. A single pair could produce over 1,000 descendants in a single year. Extrapolate that across an entire city, and you begin to grasp the scale of the infestation. And with the rats came disease. Lots of it. Typhus, leptospirosis, Weil's disease. And though bubonic plague was not the catastrophe it had once been, the memory of the Black Death still haunted the city's collective memory. By the 1830s, cholera had arrived in force, killing thousands with each outbreak. At the time, many still blamed miasma, bad air, for disease. But perceptive observers noticed something else. Cholera struck hardest in the poorest, most rat-infested areas. The filth was killing people. And the rats were both symptom and symbol. It was against this backdrop of crumbling infrastructure, rising mortality, and growing panic that the rat catchers emerged. You see, London's authorities had little coordinated pest control. It was up to property owners to deal with infestations themselves. Enter the rat catcher, a curious hybrid of tradesman, performer, and street rogue. They were often poor themselves, former butchers, laborious, even chimney sweeps. But they understood the enemy. They knew how rats moved, how they nested, and how to corner them. For a few pence, they'd plunge into a basement with nothing but a terrier and a lantern, clearing out a horde of rodents by hand. The bravest even worked in the sewers, where rats bred in the dark, humid tunnels alongside the city's waste. Mr. Jack Black, rat catcher by appointment to Her Majesty, claims to have personally dispatched more than 4,000 rats from beneath the butcher shops of Smithfield alone. Jack Black was a legend, but he was not alone. Dozens of catchers prowled the city, often competing violently for territory and clients. Some captured rats alive to sell to labs or rat pits, more on that in a moment. Others paraded their dogs through the streets, displaying piles of rat corpses as proof of their skill. Still, the problem only worsened. No matter how many rats they caught, more seemed to appear. Why? Because the real problem wasn't the rats. It was the city itself. As long as trash piled up, as long as slums festered, the rats would thrive. The catchers were not solving the problem, they were holding back a flood with a broom. By the 1850s, pressure mounted. Reformers demanded action. Engineers like Joseph Bazalgette began designing underground sewers. The government passed the Nuisances Removal Act and the Public Health Act. But for most Londoners, those solutions were years away. In the meantime, if you heard scratching in the walls, or saw something move under your bed, it was time to call the rat man. But not all rat catchers were content to just kill rodents. Some found other uses for them, uses far darker, and far more profitable. Victorian rat wars. In the shadowy underworld of Victorian London, rats weren't just pests to be exterminated. They were entertainment. And for those who knew how to exploit it, they were money on four legs. Enter the world of rat baiting, a brutal blood sport that turned rodent hunting into a public spectacle. At the heart of this grisly entertainment was the rat pit, a simple wooden enclosure often set up in the basements of taverns or behind butcher shops. It was here that crowds gathered, rich and poor alike, to watch dogs do battle with scores of live rats. Matches were timed. Bets were placed. The best dogs, usually small, wiry terriers, were bred for speed and ferocity. In elite circles, a champion dog might kill 100 rats in under 5 minutes. The stars of these shows became local legends. So too did the rat catchers who supplied the beasts for battle. Take Jack Black, Queen Victoria's self-proclaimed royal rat catcher. Jack didn't just kill rats. He bred them. He caught them alive, selecting the most aggressive for the fighting pits and the most exotic for something even stranger, the Victorian pet craze. Yes, pet rats. Jack Black was one of the first to domesticate rats, particularly those with unique coloring, white, piebald, cinnamon. These were sold to curious nobles and city ladies who kept them in elaborate cages. Some even carried them in their sleeves as conversation pieces. But the majority of Black's stock ended up in arenas soaked with sawdust and blood. In a city starved for entertainment, especially among the lower classes, rat baiting was cheap, visceral, and always thrilling. For the price of a pint, one could watch life and death unfold inches away. The audience cheered as the terrier ripped through its prey. And when it was over, the floor was swept clean, and another round began. It wasn't just sport. It was business. In 1840, the going rate was 6pence for a dozen rats. But a skilled dog might win its owner pounds in prize money. The economics were irresistible for the working class. Entire networks sprang up, rat suppliers, pit organizers, dog trainers, and even rat thieves who raided granaries and stables at night. Some men made entire livings supplying vermin to the sport. Others, less honest, reused the same rats. With missing tails or ears, they'd dye them, sell them again, and risk the dog's pride or life. But there were darker costs. In the absence of regulation, dogs often died of infected wounds. Rats, in turn, suffered slow, agonizing deaths, sometimes half alive at the end of a match. Children were frequent spectators, and in many cases, participants, sent in to retrieve wounded rats or hold dogs before the bell rang. To the emerging middle class, rat baiting was a stain on the moral fabric of England. Animal rights reformers, like those who founded the RSPCA in 1824, condemned the practice. So did clergymen and parliamentarians, who viewed it as barbaric. By the late 19th century, as reform movements gained steam and new laws were introduced, like the Cruelty to Animals Act, rat baiting became increasingly clandestine. But for decades, it was the norm, just one more way Londoners coped with the grinding filth of city life. The rat catcher wasn't just a tradesman. He was a showman, a gambler, an entrepreneur, and sometimes, a villain. Because while many worked within the grim realities of the day, others turned rat catching into extortion, fraud, or something far worse. The underground market of disease and extortion. Behind every honest rat catcher in Victorian London, there was another operating in shadows, a figure less interested in pest control than in fear, disease, and profit. Welcome to the darker side of the trade, where rats were no longer just vermin, but weapons. London's slums, especially in the East End, were plagued by rats. But not all infestations were natural. Some were planted, deliberately unleashed as part of an extortion racket. Enter the plague planters, and for many desperate men, it worked. Some even bred rats for this purpose, kept in hidden cages behind walls or under floorboards, ready to be released into rival businesses or stubborn tenements. At times, the scheme escalated into violence. Grocers and bakers, dependent on clean premises, might find their storerooms overrun overnight. Just days later, a rat catcher would appear, conveniently available for hire at twice the usual rate. These manufactured outbreaks could bankrupt a shop or drive a landlord to pay hush money. And because rats carried disease, the risk wasn't just financial. Rats in Victorian London weren't just nuisances. They were harbingers of death. Bubonic plague had faded, but typhus, leptospirosis, and rat bite fever lingered. A single rat bite could spiral into a systemic infection. Fleas riding on their backs transmitted misery at terrifying speeds. In the 1830s and 40s, cholera outbreaks had already decimated thousands. And while cholera came from contaminated water, the public didn't distinguish causes clearly. To most Victorians, rats were simply the avatars of disease. Slums like Jacob's Island or the Old Nicol teemed with rats. The Thames and its tributaries offered an endless highway for them to travel, and the city's filth gave them everything they needed: food, shelter, and cover. But where the working poor suffered, the underworld thrived. The most infamous figures weren't rat catchers at all, but what one journalist called rat contractors. These were underworld middlemen who trafficked in live vermin, smuggling them across districts, sabotaging competitors, and manipulating city contracts. They controlled rat supply chains the same way gangs control narcotics today. Corruption ran deep. London's patchwork of sanitation boards, many underfunded and overstretched, often outsourced pest control to local firms. Some of those firms had direct ties to criminal rat suppliers. A neighborhood might suffer deliberate infestations to justify the renewal of a lucrative cleanup contract. In extreme cases, deaths followed, especially in workhouses and hospitals. Hospitals, already overwhelmed, became battlegrounds. Rat-borne diseases spread through damp walls and fouled linens. Infirmaries were so poorly insulated that rats gnawed through bed frames and crawled across patients in the night. One rat catcher reported killing over 400 rats in a single hospital basement. And in cemeteries, it was no better. Rats burrowed through weak soil and fed on shallow graves. The city's overpopulation had forced mass burials, often just inches from cellar walls. When floods came, as they often did, the rats rose with them, bringing horror with every splash. This was the world rat catchers walked into, and sometimes profited from. The syndicate of scavengers. Some historians believe there was, at one point, an informal syndicate, a loose brotherhood of scavengers, including rat catchers, mudlarks, tushes, saw hunters, and dogfighters. These men shared routes, information, and the occasional bribe. They had nicknames, code signals, and territories. Rivalries could turn deadly, and disputes were often settled not by police, but by knife or dog fight. To the outside world, they were pests themselves. But to the city's underbelly, they were indispensable. But what happens when rat catchers become heroes? When the line between vermin and victim begins to blur. In the darkest corners of London, something was changing. A new science was emerging. One that would forever alter how we saw disease, and rats themselves. How rats led to modern medicine. Beneath Victorian London lay a world unseen. A labyrinth of fetid tunnels, ancient pipes, and forgotten waterways, the city's bowels. This was the realm of the Saw men, those who braved the underworld not just to survive, but to learn. And from their grime-covered findings, a new science would rise: epidemiology. Saw hunters. Tushes were the early saw explorers. Driven by poverty, they scavenged for anything of value: coins, bones, bits of copper. But they also encountered something more sinister, masses of rats thriving in the underground stew. They knew where rats bred, where the filth pooled deepest, and where the stench signaled sickness. By the mid-1800s, London's sewer system was crumbling under the weight of its own waste. Human excrement, industrial runoff, animal remains, all flowed into the Thames, the very river that provided drinking water. The rats loved it. And so did disease. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, all ravaged the city. For decades, officials clung to the miasma theory, the belief that bad air, miasma, caused illness. But one man dared to think differently. A quiet, methodical doctor with a notebook and a map. Dr. John Snow. He wasn't a rat catcher. He wasn't even interested in vermin. But in 1854, when cholera erupted in Soho, he did something radical. He asked where. Where did people get their water? Where were they dying? And most importantly, what connected them? Snow traced the outbreak to a single pump on Broad Street. He gathered data, house by house, victim by victim, and drew what became known as the ghost map. It showed a chilling pattern. Nearly all the cholera deaths clustered around that pump. And when the authorities removed its handle, the outbreak ended. John Snow had just proven that cholera spread through water, not air. It was a turning point in public health and in our understanding of rats. If water may carry death, what of the rats that drink it? What of the tunnels where disease festers like a boil beneath the city's skin? For centuries, rats were blamed for every disease. But Snow's discovery began to shift the conversation. The focus moved from the air to vectors, carriers. It wasn't just the rat, but what lived on it. Fleas, ticks, microorganisms invisible to the eye. By the late 1800s, the germ theory of disease gained ground. Scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that bacteria caused specific illnesses. Suddenly, rats weren't just disgusting, they were dangerous transport systems. The plague bacillus, Yersinia pestis, was discovered in 1894 during a Hong Kong outbreak. The culprit? Not the rats themselves, but their fleas. The work of John Snow and others forced the city's hand. In the 1860s, under engineer Joseph Bazalgette, London embarked on one of its greatest public works projects, a new sewer system. Over 1,300 miles of pipes. Massive intercepting sewers. Pumping stations that lifted waste and carried it eastward, away from the city. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Cholera faded. The Thames ran clearer. And slowly, the rats lost their dominance. But not their relevance. In the slums, the rats remained. In the pubs and the prisons. In the alleys and asylums. They adapted, as they always had. And now, science was watching. By the dawn of the 20th century, rat catching was changing. No longer just a grimy street trade, it was being professionalized. City councils hired licensed exterminators. Universities began studying rat behavior. The military trained personnel to detect rat infestations in supply lines and trenches. Some of these men called themselves rodent officers. Others used the term pest control technicians. But one thing was clear. The era of the streetwise rat catcher with a ferret and a stick was ending. Ironically, rats themselves would become lab specimens. Scientists tested medicines on them, trained them, even bred special strains for research. The rat had evolved from villain to key to understanding disease. And yet, in some ways, nothing has changed. Rats still walk our cities. They still spread illness. They still survive in the margins, where light barely reaches. But thanks to the sewer men, the scientists, and yes, even the scoundrels who profited from plague, we know how to fight them. The rat became the mirror of our filth, our fear, and our resilience. If this journey through Victorian darkness intrigued you, if the hidden history beneath your feet made you think twice before walking an alley alone, then subscribe to Historap. Like, comment, and share this tale with a friend who thinks history is boring. They haven't seen the rats yet.